The United States enemies are not going to like this video. I'm intrigued to see what is meant by that. I'm guessing it's going to be a discussion about the military power of the US, maybe the sort of economic influence of the US as well. It does seem like, countries, we all know which countries that I'm talking about here, but there's certain countries that don't like the US's influence on the rest of the world, and maybe they feel threatened by it. Like, I hope that we don't see another sort of worldwide conflict in my lifetime at least, but ever. But it does feel like we're kind of on the precipice of something, doesn't it? So yeah, let's see what's going to be discussed here.
Look at this chart. It compares military budgets of countries, but it's a bit different because it doesn't compare one country's military spending to another, but instead compares the US's military spending with the cumulative total of the 9 other countries' military spending. We're all on the top 10 list of biggest spenders. The reason? Well, the United States spent over $800 billion on its military in 2021, thus outspending South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Russia, the UK, India, and China combined.
Insane.
So there is frankly no worthwhile comparison to be made here. Yet still, after fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and after a trade war with China, as well as unfriendly relations with Iran and North Korea, the US has its fair share of enemies who undoubtedly want to hurt them in one way, shape, or form. So, hypothetically speaking, despite such a well-equipped military,
Man, this is the B-2, right? Oh my god, it's such an amazing plane. Just look at that. Mate, imagine this flying over a country in the 50s or the 40s. They would think it's a UFO. Even today, some people would still think it's a UFO.
Could an enemy ever successfully invade the US or make devastating damages to the nation in some way? Well, as it turns out, this question was a bit harder to answer than I initially planned, because the military is only one of the reasons why the US is so unconquerable. You see, the US is in an incredible position, geographically, and its secret weapon might therefore be its location. All you have to do is look at this map to understand why. For over 150 years, America's territory has stretched all the way across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. These huge coasts separate the US from any potential enemy, so even in wartime, the American mainland is very well protected. Take World War II for example, when America fought in both Europe and Asia at the same time. Barely any attacks happened on US soil during the entire war.
I'm guessing that's because, you could see an enemy coming from far away because they've got to come all the way across the ocean. It gives America a lot of time to prepare.
That meant American factories could keep making planes and weapons without interruptions, unlike the constantly bombed Soviet and British factories. On top of that, the Defense Production Act allowed the president to allocate materials and facilities for national defense, direct companies to prioritize government orders, and offer loans to companies to make this happen fast. In 2020, this law was used to increase the production of ventilators and medical-grade masks. So clearly, it's a very useful law to have in the toolbox, since the US still has a domestic industrial base with major shipyards, aviation, and automotive factories. A wartime scenario could easily involve switching to wartime production, so this makes sense. Not to mention the existing military industry, which is already making tanks, planes, weapons, and warships for the US military.
Wow.
Factories on US soil are a huge advantage, because the US military can protect its supply chain simply by defending its own territory. Very little.
Yeah, it's not like it has to rely on another country to manufacture a lot of... I'm sure the US does work with other countries on certain things, but it sounds like most of the weapons the US Army uses are made in the US, so they don't have to rely on importing stuff which could then get sabotaged.
Has to come from outside compared to its enemies, who would need to constantly run supplies across an entire ocean. I mean, just look at the size of the Atlantic Ocean and the even bigger Pacific to get an idea of just how long enemy supply chains would have to be. Not to mention the fact that with today's satellites, it would be trivially easy to spot an invasion coming from thousands of miles away and take out enemy shipments before they ever reach the US coast. Supply lines are critical.
Gosh. All these vehicles, man. This is wild. Just an entire desert full of of military equipment
in any war, and the US military is well known for its excellent logistics capabilities. They have the added advantage of the 45,000-mile highway system, which was designed with troop movements in mind. On top of that, the US has 140,000 miles of freight railway infrastructure. Now sure, this can be a double-edged sword, as enemies could use this infrastructure to penetrate into America's heartland. And infrastructure could definitely be a weak point, if not properly guarded. A good example of this would be this pipeline that runs over 5,500 miles from Texas to New Jersey and carries nearly 45% of the East Coast's fuel supply.
Wow,
in May
almost
2021,
half.
a cyber attack shut down the pipeline for 5 days. And this isn't a fluke either. China and Russia both support cybercrime groups that regularly attack government agencies and companies. The former head lawyer for the NSA, Stuart Baker, told the Washington Post, quote, "We're fighting the cyber equivalent of a land war in Asia every day."
Really?
But America's infrastructure is more than just highways and internet.
Gosh, look at this highway. This is crazy. There's like 4 layers here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've never seen that
Cables.
before.
Back in the day, another kind of highway already connected the Midwest from north to south. The Mississippi River, and the connected Missouri River, is the 4th longest river system in the world. So yeah, this river has always been crucial to connecting the economies of major cities, like New Orleans, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. Today, the river is still used to ship goods across America. So during an invasion, the Mississippi could likely help move troops and weapons too. What's impressive about the US's geography is how challenging it makes the US to conquer, and that might have to do with the diversity of terrains like deserts, swamps, and mountains. The Appalachian Mountains in the east and the Rocky Mountains in the west serve as major barriers to inland invasion, and the Great Lakes in the northeast form yet another barrier. The result is that the flatter areas along the southern border seem like the best entry point. But the US compensates for these weaknesses with huge numbers of troops stationed in California and Texas. The coasts aren't any easier to
So quick response, just in case anybody tries it.
invade, with hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in military bases. Not to mention the fact that the US has peaceful relations with its neighbors to the north and south, which both have smaller populations and militaries if any turmoil was to unfold. To the east and west, the US has no neighbors, as previously discussed, a fact which has led America to focus on other things instead of imminent invasions. On top of that, the NATO treaty requires European and Canadian allies to come to America's defense if it's ever attacked. Oh yeah, and in addition to its current military personnel, the US still maintains the selective service system. See, all males from 18 to 25 have to sign up for a lottery to be drafted in the case of a national emergency.
Really?
During the height of World War II, the US drafted over 3 million men per year.
Is that even up to this day? Like, up to this day in America, if you're a guy between 18 and 25, there's a chance you could get drafted into the military. No way, I did not know that.
So this system could potentially expand the US's military personnel by several million. And we're not even done yet, because besides all this, an invasion is still very unlikely for another reason: the Pentagon's unrivaled resources. As I mentioned in the beginning, the US's defense budget is unrivaled. The US spent almost 3 times as much as China in 2021 and 10 times more than Russia. The result is that no country has enough ships or planes to get past the US forces.
But a big chunk of that 800 billion is probably the higher salaries, no? In China, I would imagine that an average infantryman is paid a lot less than the American equivalent. So I wonder what the actual number is adjusted for the difference in salaries. Like, how much is going towards just equipment?
According to one military expert, quote, "The amphibious assault capability of the combined militaries of the world are simply too insignificant to get a beachhead on a coast." And then we of course have the civilians, who have even more guns than the military. So maybe armed citizens could also join the fight against invaders.
A good amount.
I mean, it's a possibility. But anyway, urban warfare presents more challenges than fighting in open combat and often gives an advantage to the country defending its own territory. We only have to look at Russia's failed invasion of Kiev for proof of this factor. While urban areas make up a small amount of US territory, any invader would have to take control of cities to conquer the country. since 82% of the population lives in these cities. Another advantage of armies defending their own country from invasion is the will to fight. According to the RAND Corporation, a think tank closely tied to the Pentagon, will to fight means the disposition and decision to fight, to keep fighting, and to win. The report highlights the times will to fight was emphasized in US military doctrine, demonstrating just how vital it is to military victories. You can clearly see how that influenced the outcome of World War II and the Vietnam War.
But is there a will to fight now, today, with all that's going on in terms of the economy, people struggling to keep the lights on and stuff? Like, is there an appetite? I mean, I suppose if there was an actual existential threat, Americans would definitely want to defend their country, for sure.
When a country is invaded, like Vietnam was, it's natural that the invaded country is more motivated to defend its land. I think it's safe to assume the same would apply during an invasion of the US.
Of course.
But let's shift gears for a bit and discuss one enormous US advantage I haven't mentioned, which is self-reliance for its food, energy, and weapons needs. Take these green areas for example. This land is mostly used for agriculture since only 2% of America's land is in urban areas. This low-lying land is a major reason why the US is nearly self-sufficient in agriculture and even exports food to many countries around the world. It also explains why America now actually has the most arable land in the world. That's right, the US has more arable land than India and China. What's more surprising is that India is only a third the size of the US, and China is slightly smaller but can only sustain large populations near its east coast.
Wow, so India is only a third of the size of the US, but has like 4 or 5 times the population. That is an insane statistic. That must mean India is like really like population dense. Like there's just people everywhere, right?
The crazy thing is that both of those countries have over 1.3 billion people, or about 1 billion more than the US population. And since the US is only projected to grow by another 100 million people over the next century, the US likely has enough resources to support a billion-plus population, but they don't need to. As for energy, the US also has impressive amounts of petroleum and gas, especially in parts of Texas. It has around 44 billion barrels of proved crude oil reserves and almost 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves.
Wow.
In fact, when you include biofuels, the US could be considered the largest oil producer in the world. It seems like even the bad parts of US geography have a major silver lining. The Appalachian Mountains on the east coast that I mentioned earlier aren't suited for farming, but they do have huge coal deposits that have been exploited for decades. And surprisingly, at least to me, America has the world's largest coal reserves, and loads of other natural resources from energy to metals.
Wow.
But to share a bit of a weakness of the US, it turns out it doesn't have every metal it needs to defend itself. You see,
uranium?
This shiny looking rock is a mineral called antimony, and is critical for making bullets and other weapons, and even night vision goggles. While antimony played an important role in World War II ammunition production, the last mine in the US closed in 1997. The US is therefore reliant on China and Russia, its two biggest military rivals, for supply of this critical mineral. So
also, didn't for the SR-71, didn't America have to like smuggle the titanium out of Russia? I think I heard a story about that.
the US does have weaknesses, but who could actually have the military might and, most importantly, motivation to try and invade the US? Well, the latest US defense strategy names the People's Republic of China as the US's most consequential strategic competitor, and notes that Russia poses acute threats. Beyond these two big threats, it also mentions North Korea and Iran. But let's focus on China for a bit. It's true that China is slowly building up its military capabilities, but it isn't even ready to launch an invasion on the island of Taiwan, let alone the west coast of the United States. I don't think I even need to mention how the loss of its largest trading partner would devastate the Chinese economy. Still, there's some reason for concern. If China disabled American satellites, it could debilitate the US military's ability to monitor troop movements in real time. If you're thinking this sounds like science fiction though, you'd be wrong, because in 2007, China successfully destroyed one of its own satellites with a ballistic missile. Floating 850 kilometers above the Earth, the destroyed satellite is at a similar similar altitude to US intelligence satellites. So China could theoretically destroy them too.
Yeah, that was definitely a show of force from China, wasn't it?
In terms of Russia, well, they have now performed a similar test, which endangered the crew of the ISS. Taking out satellites is a bit extreme though, because it causes hazardous space debris that would affect all current and future satellites. That includes Russia's and China's satellites. But Russia and China are already interfering with US satellites on a daily basis. They're just using lasers and jammers instead of trying to shoot them down. What's even scarier though is China's recent investments in AI and quantum computing, which could change the future of warfare. I mean, imagine how hard it would be for the Pentagon to strategize against an enemy using an AI supercomputer to calculate decisions in milliseconds. But if we look at Russia again for a second, their military has turned out to be much more disorganized and incompetent than we imagined before their invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. Still, they're definitely a force to be reckoned with nearly 1 million troops, thousands of vehicles, and specialized hacker units.
Yeah, but I just don't think they're a threat to the US at this point. I think Putin knows that.
As for other potential attackers, North Korea, for example, may boast that their nuclear weapons can reach the US mainland, but owing to their low budget and antique equipment, there's no way they could invade the entire US. Iran is a similar story, except that they don't yet have a nuclear warhead, although they're not far off. Realistically speaking, both countries use nukes to preserve the regime rather than actually use them against their enemies. Cuba and Venezuela are two other enemy nations in the US's backyard, but their troop numbers and military budgets are hardly enough to invade the United States. And if all else fails to stop an invasion, we shouldn't forget that America is a nuclear-armed nation itself. It has a triad of air, land, and sea missiles, which make it impossible to take out entirely. Land missiles are stored in the center of the country, and the sea missiles are in submarines, which are constantly on the move, hidden away without a blip on the radar.
Plus, because of the whole mutually assured destruction thing with nukes, I don't think anyone's actually dumb enough to launch a nuke at another country. I don't think, because they would know that they would just get nuked back, right? Like, there's no winner in nuclear war. There's just no winner.
Since the Cold War though, nuclear weapons have acted more as a deterrent rather than a direct threat. You see, the principle of mutually assured destruction essentially means anyone who uses a nuke will get nuked back, launching a chain reaction of nuclear warfare, eventually obliterating Earth and ending humanity. But just for fun, let's compare nuclear arsenals. Alright, so the US and Russia currently have around 5,000 nukes, with around 1,500 deployed at heavy bomber bases and on intercontinental missiles. And then we of course have China. It has a couple hundred nuclear weapons, but none of them are deployed. Now, these numbers might seem high since they can literally eradicate humanity, but this is actually a low point from the peak of 70,000 nukes worldwide in the mid-1980s. What's still quite worrying though is that while the US claims to have decommissioned over 11,000 nuclear warheads since 1994, China and Russia are thought to be increasing their stockpile. But despite this, I hope you can see how costly it would be to even attempt an invasion of the US. Any hypothetical invasion would have to overcome the US's huge military and geographical advantages to gain any ground.
It wouldn't happen unless there was like a multi-country alliance. But the thing is, the US would have NATO behind them. So it would, whatever country it was, would need literally almost every other country in the world. But even then, it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be enough. I just don't think it's ever... I mean, never say never, but I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening.
While it is plausible that a major state actor like China or Russia could take out satellites and hack critical infrastructure, they'd also have to contend with the millions of well-equipped troops on the ground and a hostile armed population.
I just don't think China could win a war of attrition with the US. Like, China would run out of resources faster, I think.
So realistically, a physical invasion isn't really a possibility, but what if America's enemies could get what they wanted without an invasion? Well, it turns out it's much easier to conquer hearts and minds in an information war than to win with soldiers on the ground. And that might have something to do with Russia's influence campaign in the 2016 US presidential elections. See, after a 3-year investigation, a bipartisan US Senate committee recently concluded that Russia conducted an influence campaign to help Donald Trump get elected. If that's not shocking enough, the report states that Vladimir Putin himself ordered the hacking of Democratic Party emails to be leaked over WikiLeaks. The FBI now has a warrant out for 12 Russian military intelligence officers it believes interfered in the 2016 elections. So this is a serious incident. A recent report by a group of intelligence agencies claims Russia tried to interfere again in 2020, though on a smaller scale. Whether Russia continues to meddle in US politics in the future or not, the damage may already be done as Americans increasingly report a loss of faith in democracy and government institutions.
Interesting. So they're using other tactics rather than just boots on the ground. Wow. I mean, that's an issue, I suppose, with AI as well. Like if we do end up creating, super intelligence that is just way smarter than any human, like hostile states will probably have that as well. And then they'll ask the AI to, create alternative warfare tactics, with the goal of beating the US or whatever. But everybody will eventually have these AI systems, so it will just be like AI versus AI. I do think the US just has so many advantages, like the video talked about, just geography, financial resources, educated population, patriotic population. It's just, I just don't see, even if China, Russia. But I think apart from those two, every other country they wouldn't want to lose the trading relationship, everything else that they have with the US. So yeah, I just don't see it happening, but it could. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.